Hey y'all, it's Jonathan, and I am back with another video. I know it has been a minute. I did actually just upload a video on here that I recorded back in January, but with good reason. But I know it's been a minute. I definitely wanted to come on here and do a recap of all of the books that I have read from January to April. So if you're interested in seeing what I've read these past couple of months, keep watching, and let's get right into this. So, I have read, I think, a total of 9 books in the past 4 months, and it feels terrible saying that, but I'm trying to get better. Summer's coming up. I'm getting used to my schedule, and I'm going to have a lot more time to read and get reviews out and do content. I do have a Goodreads goal of reading 60 books before the end of the year. So I've got to put things into overdrive. It keeps reminding me that I'm 8 books behind at this point. But I have been reading some good stuff. I have been reading some things that I haven't necessarily enjoyed as much, but I'm here to talk all about that. So let's get into these 9 books that I have read in the months of January, February, March, and April. So I kicked off my year with James Baldwin. The Evidence of Things Not Seen, which is a reissue of The Evidence of Things Not Seen, which was his last novel, his last essay collection, his last piece of work before his passing. And so The Evidence of Things Not Seen is it's an investigative piece. So, said over 22 months in 1979 and 1981, nearly 24 children were unspeakably murdered in Atlanta despite national attention and outcry. They were all Black. James Baldwin investigated these murders, the Black administration in Atlanta, and Wayne Williams, the Black man tried for the crimes. Because there was only evidence to convict Williams for the murder of 2 men, the children's cases were closed, offering no justice to the family or the country. Baldwin's incisive analysis implicates the failures of integration as the guilty party, arguing there could be no more devastating proof of this assault than the slaughter of the children. As Stacey Abrams writes in her foreword, the humanity of Black children, of Black men and women, of Black lives has ever been a conundrum for America. 40 years on, Baldwin's writing reminds us that we have never resolved the core query. Do Black lives matter? Unequivocally, the moral answer is yes, but Baldwin refuses such rhetorical comfort. In this, his last book, By Excavating America's Race Relations, Baldwin exposes the hard-to-face ingrained issues and demands that we all reckon with them. And so, I definitely have my critiques about the fact that Stacey Abrams did do the foreword for that, which I do talk about in my most recent video, my book review / reflection on reading The Evidence of Things Not Seen. But once again, James Baldwin's work always gets me together. It always sets me right. It sets the tone for like what I want to do moving forward. And so I think that everybody needs to pick up The Evidence of Things Not Seen. Check out that review because I really dive deeply in like kind of just why it feels so relevant in the year 2023. And it's so wild that after 40 years, James Baldwin's words just constantly ring true. And so that one clip of him where he's like,
"You always told me it takes time. It has taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brothers and my sisters' time, my nieces and my nephews' time. How much time do you want for your progress?"
It's one of those things where it's like James Baldwin knew so much. He knew so much, and it's just always awesome to take in his words. And so I will be reading some more Baldwin this year. I have a stack of Baldwin novels that I have not yet even touched. So everybody check out that review of The Evidence of Things Not Seen, and we'll talk more. Let me know your thoughts. So after I finished The Evidence of Things Not Seen, I finished a novel that I had started back in December of 2022, young adult novel, The Sunbearer Trials by Aiden Thomas. Now, I had read Cemetery Boys, which was Aiden Thomas's debut YA novel, and that was also fantasy, queer, trans, fantasy, amazing, debut from a YA author. And so I absolutely loved it. And it was one of my staff picks at Prologue Bookshop. But then the follow-up novel by Aiden Thomas was a Peter Pan retelling. And I didn't necessarily hear the best reviews about it, and I skipped reading that one. But when I saw that Aiden Thomas was coming out with a new novel, I think that they had published some graphics for it on Twitter, I was like, oh, this is dope. And so it was fantasy. It had really cool looking characters, and I was already hearing like, you know, Hunger Games comparisons. I never actually read the Hunger Games. So even when I talk about like it has that Hunger Games element, I've seen the movies. Don't come at me about that. But when I had gone to Summer Institute in Phoenix, Arizona, they had arcs of the Sunbearer trials. I got a copy, did not read the arc because it was in like this like 2-point font, and the pages looked like they had been scanned from like the manuscript. So I was like, I'm good. I'll wait until the novel comes out to actually read it. And I wound up starting to read it around Christmas, and I finished it up a little while later because I took like a break in between. Sunbearer Trials was really good. I enjoyed it. I definitely have had complicated feelings about a lot of YA literature that I've been reading lately. And one of the main things is that I've been very annoyed by the main characters. A lot of the main characters in YA books are really whiny. I don't know, they complain a lot. And so I kind of, you know, I have to remember these are teenagers. The intended audience for these books are teenagers. And so that like feeling where you're like, sort of like angsty and moody and feel some type of way towards your parents all the time. That's the way that a lot of us felt when we were teenagers. And I don't want to discount that they were serious to us, you know, at the time. So I won't say more serious than they actually were. But there were definitely more pressing issues that adults like thought were important versus like some of our like gripes about certain things. And so I've been very annoyed with a lot of YA main characters. And I would say this main character, Teo, was a bit whiny, kind of annoying, but I did enjoy the other characters in this novel that surrounded them. The main character, Teo, is trans, and I'll actually read the description. It says, as each new decade begins, the sun's power must be replenished so that Soul can keep traveling along the sky and keep the chaotic obsidian gods at bay. Soul selects 10 of the most worthy Semodioses to compete in the Sunbearer trials. The winner carries light and life to all the temples of Reino de Sol, but the loser has the greatest honor of all. They will be sacrificed to Sol, their body melted down to refuel the sunstones, protecting the world for another 10 years. Teo, a 17-year-old Jade Semodios, and the trans son of the goddess of birds, isn't worried about the trials, at least not for himself. His best friend, Naya, is a gold Semodios and a shoe-in for the trials, and while he trusts her abilities, the odds of becoming the sacrifice is 1 in 10. But then, for the first time in over a century, the impossible happens. Soul chooses not 1, but 2 Jade competitors, Ted and Zio, the 13-year-old child of the god of bad luck. Now they must compete in 5 trials against gold opponents who are more powerful and better trained. Worst of all, Teo's annoyingly handsome ex-best friend, Aurelio, is favored to win. Teo is determined to get himself and his friends through the trials unscathed for fame, glory, and their own survival. So this it was Hunger Games adjacent, I will say. It had that competition aspect where people are chosen to compete in the competition, and it did have that sort of like class divide where the Jades are sort of like the lower class, and the other competitors are like the gods. They are the wealthy. They are the heroes of this society. And so they have a little bit more privilege. They're more respected. Meanwhile, Teo and Zio are kind of just like not really respected amongst their peers. They don't have the same freedoms. They don't have the same respect. Like they have like these like trading cards that they're featured on. And so I think that this was a nice spin, a way to sort of create a world similar to that of like a Hunger Games society, but to add in that representation, you know, having a trans main character, having Latinx main characters in this Latinx society, featuring so much Latinx culture. And so I really did appreciate that. I always love the descriptions of like the food in the novels. Like food will always get to me. And so I was able to imagine what this world did look like. The battle scenes were intense. I think that it was overall very well written. It did kind of drag a little bit towards the end, but the ending set things up well for a sequel. So I think Aiden Thomas did a successful job in their third YA release. I'm pretty sure this is their third, and I am excited to read the sequel. I think that it will be really cool to see where this series goes next. And I really want Aiden Thomas just to continue producing work that showcases Latinx trans characters. Like I understand that I think Lost in the Neverwoods was the book that was intended to be their first novel, but they wound up releasing Cemetery Boys instead. And I think there's a reason that Cemetery Boys was so successful. I think that it felt extremely, like it was a very heartfelt, authentic, powerful read. And so I think that following that up with Lost in the Neverwoods was kind of just like, I understand that you put your heart and soul into this novel, but even based on the reviews, it's just like, this is not what I think is your strongest voice. So I think that you can see that they came back strong with the Sunbearer Trials. So definitely check out the Sunbearer Trials if you have not already. So after that, I technically kicked off the year in the Black and Love book club that I have at Prologue Bookshop. We kicked the year off by reading Memorial by Bryan Washington, and I did a review about Memorial a long time ago. If you have not watched that, I'll definitely link it in the description box. I haven't watched that review in a very long time, but I will say, reading Memorial again, it was not, and hearing reflections from the other people in my book club, I definitely will have to read it another time. I will definitely have to read it a third time to really let it sink in. And I can see the different perspectives. Some people that didn't necessarily love the novel as much as I did on my first read, but I think that there's always like a time and place when a novel will really be impactful to you. And I think that Memorial was really an impactful read for me. I read it in like the winter of 2021, like right after it came out. What's that, 2021? I think that was 2020 when it came out. And now it's in paperback. I actually really love the paperback cover, so definitely check it out. Now that it's in paperback, get a little bit of a cheaper copy. And I do love the orange on the paperback cover. I'll put it somewhere around here. But I'm super excited to see what Bryan Washington is going to release next. And I think that Memorial the rights have been purchased to produce a series, possibly for HBO. I'll link that story somewhere. But I'm really excited. I want to see it play out on the screen. I think that Memorial was made to be on the screen. I can see it now. I can see the lighting. I can see the dynamic between the characters on screen. I absolutely love Bryan Washington's writing, and so I'm excited to see what he does next in terms of what work is going to follow up Memorial and Lot stories. I'm just excited. So definitely check out Memorial if you haven't already. It's been years since it came out, but now that it's in paperback, go pick up a copy, okay? So after I read Memorial, I hopped back into YA. And the follow-up YA book, after reading Sunbearer Trials that I read this from January, and I started in January, finished it towards the end of February, was Highly Suspicious and Unfairly Cute by Talia Hibbert. Now, I read Dani Brown. I loved Dani Brown. I will recommend Dani Brown to everybody, right? And so seeing that Talia Hibbert made the decision to go into YA, I was a little worried. I did not know, upon picking up this book, downloading the audiobook, seeing the book the day it came out, I did not know that it was YA. I did not. Reading the back of it, I didn't know it was YA. It wasn't until I got a couple of chapters into the book that I realized that these kids were high school. These kids were high school students. And so that was really shocking for me. was like, oh, Talia Hibbert is is releasing a YA book. And so this was interesting. I'll read the description and then we can get into my review of the book. So it says, from the New York Times bestselling author of the Brown Sisters trilogy comes a laugh-out-loud story about a quirky content creator and a clean-cut athlete testing their abilities to survive the great outdoors and each other. Bradley Graham is pretty much perfect. He's a star football player, manages his OCD well enough, and comes out on top of all his classes, except the ones he shares with his ex-best friend, Celine. Celine Bangura is conspiracy theory obsessed. Social media followers eat up her takes on everything from UFOs to holiday overconsumption, yet she's still not cool enough for the popular kids table, which is why Brad abandoned her for the in-crowd years ago. At least that's how Celine sees it. These days, there's nothing between them other than petty insults and academic rivalry, so when Celine signs up for a survival course in the woods, she's surprised to find Brad right beside her. Forced to work as a team for the chance to win a grand prize, these two teens must trudge through not just mud and dirt, but their messy past, and as the adventure brings them closer together, they begin to remember the good bits of their history. But as too much time passed, or just enough to spark a whole new kind of relationship. And so I wound up writing a review on Goodreads for this one, and so I just wrote, what happens when a football player with OCD and a conspiracy theorist with Annalise Keating-X aspirations are stranded in the woods in the hope of obtaining a once-in-a-lifetime scholarship? They fall in love. So that was my synopsis of that. I will say that I feel like this YA piece had its ups and downs. It definitely had its ups and downs. I've seen extremely positive reviews of it. Talia Hibbert made the decision to make these characters kind of like as unconventional as possible. He had his struggles being neurodivergent, queer, a person of color, and they're both like have these unconventional sort of parental relationships also at the same time. And so while I did find these characters to be entertaining, I found them to be flawed, I found them to be very endearing, I do feel like for characters to be so complex, they wound up kind of reading extremely flat. I felt like Bradley being bi was kind of an afterthought. It's mentioned one or two times that he has like this attraction to like celebrities, like male celebrities, and he like mentions it one or two times, having like a crush on a guy. I know I'm not qualified to critique OCD rep at all, right? But it did feel like it wasn't as well thought out as it could have been. In addition to that, Celine's conspiracy theory habit were sprinkled in here and there, but I never really felt like it contributed enough to her character to make sense. Like she would randomly, it would randomly be brought up that she has like this conspiracy theory podcast. But I wanted it to make her character a little bit more quirky, but it didn't really add that much to her character at all. I really was, going back to this book being YA, I was really lost in the beginning, and I was not aware that it was YA. Until I realized it was YA, I will say that if I had gone halfway through this book not knowing it was YA, I would have DNF'd it. But I really did power through this novel hoping that it would eventually connect, and it really didn't connect for me, especially as somebody that thoroughly enjoyed Talia Hibbert's other work. Eventually, I will say that once it got past the halfway mark, the novel did find its pace. The development of Celine and Bradley's relationship was cute. I thoroughly enjoy Bradley's character more than I enjoyed Celine's character. She was one of those, she was a little bit more whiny too in terms of YA main characters, and some of her gripes and different things with her mother were a bit frustrating. But I will say that it did really have its shining moments, especially when Celine's relationship with her father was really we really were given a chance to delve into the relationship that Celine had with her father, which was really the whole basis of why she was entering in this competition in the first place, outside of you know, having these dreams of being a lawyer, you know. A lot of that was based in her relationship with her father. But I really wanted that to be discussed even more. Like, I understand this was a romance, but I enjoy romances that really do dive into the personal, outside of just like the love connection between two characters. I really do honestly think that YA readers will enjoy this, but it wasn't 100% for me. And I don't think that a lot of YA readers will necessarily be reading into it as much as I have. And the things that bother me will not necessarily bother YA readers, will not necessarily bother teenagers as much. But, you know, I gave this book a solid 3 out of 5 on Goodreads. But if I were recommending, I would recommend this to YA readers, because I think that after especially watching other people's videos and reviews, I do see the side of like why some people thought that this was just like an overall 5 out of 5 super enjoyable YA romance, but it just wasn't necessarily for me. Chaos Theory was another YA book that I read after this one, and this was the first book that I had ever read by Nick Stone. And I'm glad that I read it when I did, because right after I read this book, Nick Stone came out with like an interview with Ibram X. Kendi that irritated me. And so that impression of Nick Stone would probably have ruined how I felt going into this book. So I'm glad that I saw that afterwards. We can have some discourse about that another time. But Chaos Theory was the first book I read by Nick Stone. It definitely was a very wild ride. So the novel essentially follows two high school seniors on the edge of graduation. Shelby is a space-loving genius with bipolar disorder, and Andy, aka Walter, aka Wally Wall, is the similarly intelligent biracial son of a conservative Black woman politician and an alcoholic. These two connect when Andy accidentally drunk texts Shelby while at a party, thinking that it is his ex-girlfriend. And while it really begins as this anonymous exchange of text messages, as in any YA romance in general, it turns into something more. I did a very quick tweet and delete describing this as the YA 7 Days in June. And as ridiculous as that sounds, it actually kind of makes sense. Two teens with deeply ingrained trauma based on childhood events, stumbling upon each other and falling in love, having this whirlwind love affair. Very 7 Days in June. Honestly, I will say the 7 Days in June teens coming back together as fully developed adults, you know? I will say the story was gripping. I really stuck with these characters. I wanted to find out what led them to their current states, why Shelby was so distrusting of friends and relationships, and what happened between Andy and his ex-girlfriend. Nick Stone begins in her introduction saying that she really wants this novel to help readers understand mental illness and fight the stigma. And I don't necessarily know if this novel accomplishes that. Shelby does work to educate Andy on her mental illness and how to be a good friend. Walter's storyline, to me, feels a bit more compelling. I find that his alcoholism and the level of toxicity and drama that ensues with his family is just a bit more compelling to me. And it really overshadows that mental health angle when it comes to discussing like bipolar disorder, which Nick Stone actually discusses in her introduction, that she is, that's something that she has dealt with. So that perspective is really personal to her. And so I wound up really not knowing if I came out of this book learning anything necessarily. It was a really good example of a book that can deal with a relevant topic, but does not necessarily leave me with much food for thought when I am done. And I really was left with more questions than answers after I finished, such as, what's going on with Walter's conservative mom? How did she get to this point? This pregnancy termination, the handling of Walter's alcoholism. And so I think that dealing with such complex issues like teenage alcoholism, I was kind of confused at the end and how it wrapped up so succinctly. And so coming out of this book, I was like, will I read more from Nick Stone? Possibly. But this book was definitely a wild ride. So if the books are as chaotic and dramatic as Chaos Theory, I definitely will dive into more. So if anybody has any other suggestions as to Nick Stone books that I should check out, let me know. I do want to read some more YA, and I want to see what people's suggestions are, and then I will make sure to give my honest feedback when I'm done. After I read Chaos Theory, I read Dyscalculia, a love story of epic miscalculation by Camonghne Felix. And this was the March book club book for the Black and Love book club. And I thoroughly enjoyed reading this. So it says, when Camonghne Felix goes through a monumental breakup, culminating in a hospital stay, everything from her early childhood trauma and mental health to her relationship with mathematics shows up in the tapestry of her healing. Felix repossesses herself through the exploration of history she'd left behind, using her childhood dyscalculia, a disorder that makes it difficult to learn math, as a metaphor for the consequences of her miscalculations in love. Through reckoning with this breakup and other adult gambles in intimacy, Felix asks the question, who gets to assert their right to pain? Dyscalculia negotiates the misalignments of perception and reality, love and harm, and the politics of heartbreak, both romantic and familial. And so the main character in this novel goes through a lot. You wind up reading this story in the beginning about our author's relationship. And so you get your initial assumptions as to what led to this breakup that she has. And then as you're reading, you begin to kind of like, it begins to unravel for you. And I think that it really takes a lot for an author, especially with a memoir, to kind of like show that they are in the wrong, that they are a flawed person. I feel like we've been flooded with so many memoirs from people that are in their 20s and 30s. And it's like, what are you offering us in this memoir for us to reflect on? Have you even reflected in your own life? Have you lived enough to really learn lessons from these experiences that you have had? So going into memoirs, as I've been handed so many memoirs, and I've gotten so many arcs of memoirs, I'm like, what is this memoir going to offer me that I'll come out on the other side and be like, oh wow, this is something else, you know? Where's that life-changing memoir? And so I think that this, she did a really great job at just like reflecting on her own life and coming out in the end with some lessons. And so I think that this is a really good read. I think that it was creative and I really actually enjoyed it. After I read Dyscalculia, I finally read Blood Debts by Terry J. Benton-Walker. When I had gone to Summer Institute last summer in Phoenix, Arizona, I got the chance to meet Terry J. Benton-Walker, and I got a signed arc of Blood Debts. And so I was super excited for this. I'll read the description and then we will get into how I felt about this. So 30 years ago, a young woman was murdered, a family was lynched, and New Orleans saw the greatest magical massacre in its history. In the days that followed, a throne was stolen from a queen. Now Clement and Christina Trudeau, the 16-year-old twin heirs to the powerful, magical dethroned family, discover their mother has been cursed by someone on the very magical council their family used to rule, someone who will come for them next. Clement and Christina's only hope of discovering who is coming after their family is to trust each other, to trust their magic, and solve the decades-old murder. If they don't succeed, New Orleans may see another massacre, or worse. So this was the arc of the novel, and I wound up picking up the physical copy of the book when it came out, and I then also listened to it. So I read some of it physical, and then I also listened to it on audio. And so this is the final cover. I actually really love it. I think that the characters look great on the cover. I think that it's beautifully done. I love the font. And so I had a lot of feelings about this. And I will start by saying I think that Terry J. Benton-Walker is a extremely creative author. I think that the ideas that they put into this novel, that they were formulating that he was formulating in his mind, that he really wanted to put on the page, I think that it shows that he's very creative and that he wanted to showcase a Black queer character, Black queer main character, and wanted to showcase Black queer characters in a story without there being violence towards them, specifically for being queer. I think that he also wanted to be able to talk about race and class and insert his political thoughts into this work. Now, I think that the execution is where my issues were. I gotta make sure that I look at my notes because I don't want to just like kind of rant on and on. Blood Debts is really compelling when it comes to the story of family conflict, magic, corruption, and self-discovery. I enjoyed the fact that the main characters had such a strong sense of family history and had to put aside differences to solve this mystery. I did enjoy Clem as a narrator, and I'll definitely get into it a little bit later when I talk about some of my other critiques of the book, but I really do wish that he narrated the entire novel. I enjoyed Clem as a character. I think that it was really nice to see like this very like free, Black queer young man who's kind of taking ownership of, his family history, the magic that his family has, and he really wants to carry on his family legacy. I enjoyed the acceptance of Clem's queerness, as I kind of said earlier, without any overt homophobia flung at him. This novel was fairly trauma-free on that side of things, so I really did appreciate that. This novel did have so many bright spots. When it came to Clem, when it came to the magic, when it came to like the plot. I will say that was solid. The shortcomings came in the details. Blood Debts has everything that is necessary to be a great novel. It's just too much for a single book. It clocks in at 396 pages, and it felt like it was a prequel, a debut, and a sequel all in one book. There was so much background information that was provided that I don't even necessarily think that we necessarily needed to know all of that. That's something that could be included in a prequel or a sequel, really diving deep into some of the family conflict from the past, getting all this information. You kind of want it very quick in that debut. You want to sort of understand what's going on, but you don't want to like get chapters and chapters and page upon page about like what happened 20, 30 years ago, the dynamic between these characters that aren't even present in the novel as like main characters. So all of those side stories and different things like that felt like they just added so much to the book that it became confusing. And so I will say that like I wound up saying in my Goodreads review that it did feel like a bit of a first draft. And the editor really should have advised him to save some of this material for the sequel. For multiple different conflicts that deserve more attention and detail, outside of trying to find out who is attacking their family, there's this mystery surrounding their grandmother, illegitimate children, beef with a white bar owner and his closeted son, which becomes an added chapter and an added narrator to this novel. A few murders and necromancy. And so it really doesn't help that this story is told from multiple perspectives. So we get Christina and Clement's perspective, and we get a new character towards the end that I'm not going to spoil for anybody that plans on picking this up. So it has too many characters, storylines for me to keep up with. I'm not a person that's good with like switching back and forth between like multiple different storylines because this book has so many characters, so you get so many different names that you're trying to keep up with. There are side stories that you're trying to keep up with. And so it just overall became like very confusing. Christina's narrating is very clunky, too much telling and not enough showing. And so I really did not like Christina's character. So Christina is she's dating this white boy, and he very clearly is doing some underhanded shit. And her brother keeps telling her that he's sneaky and he's not to be trusted, but she is clearly trying to go against what everybody looking sideways at this white boy that she's dating. And so it winds up biting her in the ass. And so that character was extremely frustrating. So to have her also narrating and her being so oblivious to so much, it was a bit frustrating. So I would have enjoyed having Clem's perspective, to be honest. So had the story simply been told from Clem's perspective, it would have forced the story to be a bit less all over the place. And this is just a personal pet peeve because I feel like teenagers may easily latch onto this story. But I had a difficult time with the narrators and keeping up with so many names and storylines. And if an author introduces too many characters, it doesn't give each storyline enough attention, and it really just begins to feel clunky. When it comes to my personal gripes with the story, it is Clem and Chris's relationship. Their arguments were very petty and random. They would make up and then fall out all over again over something else foolish. There was a lot of yelling and cussing at adult figures. And realistically, I don't think that this type of disrespect would fly in any Black household, especially Southern Black households. It was just really wild to see the way that, like, Clem would, like, cuss out his aunt. I'm just like, I don't know, it's just like a personal gripe of mine. Like, I'm not one of those people that's like, no, kids are required to always be like very like quiet and, you know, hands folded, respectful to adults. But it was just really wild. And so the reactions from his aunt and from his mother when he would do certain things, I'm just like, this is not believable to me. You know, I don't know necessarily what that is supposed to show, like, teenagers, like, if you're trying to, like, or if it's supposed to reflect a certain dynamic. I don't know, but it kind of made me have a little bit less respect for the characters. And overall, by the time we get to the end of the story, we found out that it happened within like 2 weeks. So you have a main character that's like falling in love. Within 2 weeks, you've got this series of like wild events, building relationships, building friendships, families coming back together and falling apart within a couple of weeks. Murder, you know, it's a lot. It's a lot. Another side note, this book is connected through these like different quotes from various like activists and people within Black history. And I felt like that was a bit much, considering that I didn't feel it placed the book in a space that I don't know if the author necessarily wants the book to be placed in. You know, like, this book is a fantasy novel, you know? And so I think to kind of like try to make your book seem more socially conscious than it is, it makes me expect certain things out of the book. And it makes me sort of place your book into a certain category where I have to be more critical of it. And I have to think about the dynamics between the characters a little bit more deeply, because you are like using these activists and these great Black thinkers as like these connecting pieces to your novel. And so I think that actually does the book a little bit of a disservice. Once again, this novel had all of the elements. It's just the execution that bothered me, but I really do hope that it does have a sequel, because the ending with Clem was interesting, and John Louise, I really did love that character. And so I think that this book had the pieces to be really great. It wound up just being a bit underwhelming for me, or a bit overwhelming for me. I think that it even could have been better if it wasn't YA. I think that I would have appreciated this book a little bit more if it didn't fall into that YA category. I feel like placing it in the YA category put limits on it. And I feel like this would have been a great fiction novel. You just like up the age of the characters a little bit, and you could drive this book home. you know, make it a little bit more intense. The language could be a bit more mature, because I don't know, it just felt like it wanted to be so many different things, but it just kind of wound up falling a bit flat for me. But I am excited for the sequel, and I do think that this is worth checking out. You know, I follow Terry J. Benton-Walker on Instagram, and seeing him on Twitter talking about his work and planning out the sequel for the novel. So I'm going to check out the sequel. I think that it would be a bit dishonest for me to not give a full critique of Blood Debts, but I do think that it is worth picking up. It definitely was a debut. It definitely was a debut, and I think that there is work that can be done to make sure that its sequel is a bit more successful. It's worth the read, so check it out. And then last but not least, the last book that I read was Elite Capture: How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else by Olúfẹ Táíwò. He is the assistant professor of philosophy at Georgetown University, received his PhD in philosophy at the University of California. He's published for Public Affairs Quarterly, One Earth Philosophical Papers, and the American Philosophical Association newsletter, Philosophy and the Black Experience. And I follow him on Twitter, and I had seen this book on my timeline. And as soon as I read the title and the subtitle, I was like, this is something that I have to read. And so I felt so many different ways about the way that identity politics has been presented and plays a role in so many aspects of our society currently. And I think that it was seeing a commercial, this was like way back, where it was Tamika Mallory in a Cadillac commercial talking about like black girl magic. And that is when I knew that shit was going bad. I have had like this huge pet peeve at the way that we've seen capitalism co-opt so much radical ideology in order to kind of just like sell products, like keep people complacent. Reading The Evidence of Things Not Seen, even, James Baldwin specifically talks about the role of the black mayor, and that governments will only do what's necessary to maintain the status quo. And that having black people in these positions of power and then nothing changing in the material lives of black people, it just shows that all these people are there for is to maintain the status quo. And so we've got people talking about all of these firsts and these companies, these billion-dollar companies talking about posting, like making these like Black Lives Matter messages and celebrating Martin Luther King Day, and, you know, pushing all of these black faces to show that they are doing the work and that they care about black people, that they care about the collective struggles of like people within our society, you know, queer folks, trans folks, poor folks, women. They don't really care. They're just co-opting identity politics, and people are cool with it. Two strategic trends in response quickly become clear: the elite's tactic of performing symbolic identity politics to pacify protesters without enacting material reforms, and their efforts to rebrand, not replace, existing institutions, also using elements of identity politics. And so the author really like goes in and just talks about all of the ways that elites have sort of been able to steer resources and institutions that could serve the many towards their own narrower interests and aims. The term is used in economics, political science, and related disciplines to describe the way socially advantaged people tend to gain control over benefits meant for everyone. In this context, it has been used much like the more familiar label of corruption, and identified by similar symptoms of undue influence such as bribes. But the concept has also been applied to describe how political projects more generally can be hijacked in principle or in effect by the well-positioned and better resourced. And so this really just put so much language to a lot of the things that have just been frustrating me, that I see on social media, that I've been seeing just in politics. And so I think that Elite Capture is really worth the read if you're somebody that wants to that really wants to understand what you've been seeing. And so it keeps me on my toes. I think having this definition for what I've been seeing, knowing that this is elite capture, this phenomenon is elite capture, and that there are ways that we really need to start thinking about ways to combat it. And, you know, do I think that this book has all of the answers? No. But do I think that it is a very necessary read if you're just like, I need some language for what I've been seeing? I think that this is a 10 out of 10, and I would highly recommend all of you reading this. I think that the writing is very accessible. I love that the author included like a hefty notes section with all of these citations that I will be slowly but surely going through and picking up the work that he references in Elite Capture. But I think that, you know, starting off the year with the evidence of things not seen, finishing off this quarter of the year with Elite Capture has really put me in a really great place. And I want to keep on reading more and more. So my nonfiction reads are they're going to become more intense. So I think that Elite Capture is a must read for everybody. So that is what I've been reading from January through April. Hopefully this video isn't too long once I edit it, but I had a lot to talk about and I had a lot of thoughts. Let me know what you've been reading over the past couple of months. What do you think that I should read? Have you read any of the things that I have read, and what have been your thoughts? Do you feel the same way? Do you feel differently? I'm all for a healthy conversation in the comment section, and I will catch all of you in the next one. Make sure you subscribe to my Patreon if you haven't already. If you want to support me, I will see y'all soon. And always remember that you are loved.